What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Offbeat Gardener. I'm gardening in Zone 7A. Today I want to talk to you guys about starting a container garden, or even just a garden in general if you've never had one before. As you can see, we're in the thick of winter right now. There's snow everywhere. My grow bags are mostly empty. I am doing a container garden as opposed to an in-ground garden, and I wanted to talk to you guys about that a little bit because I know when I started my garden, I'll insert a picture here. You see those 5 green grow bags? That's pretty much what I started with, and it somehow morphed into this very quickly because I just fell in love with gardening so much that the 5 bags just weren't enough for me, and I just had to expand. And before I knew it, this is where I landed, and I'm not mad at it because it's awesome, and I get to grow a bunch of food in a small place. I'm sure some of you are looking at this and saying, well, that's a huge piece of land right there for a backyard. Why aren't you just growing in the ground? Well, that's part of the reason why I wanted to make this video, because when I started out, all I knew is that I wanted to start a garden, and I knew that my soil here is basically trash. It's just a bunch of rocks covered with a little bit of topsoil. So growing in the ground was not an option for me. Not having too much experience and not knowing enough at the time, I had to come up with a plan B, and my plan B to basically accomplish my goal, which was to start a garden, was to do it in a container, in some sort of container or pot. There are reasons why I chose these particular kind of pots, which I'll get into a little bit later, but if I knew then what I know now in terms of growing in the ground, where it is possible for you to go to a garden center or somewhere, some kind of soil and compost supplier, and order cubic yards of soil and, lay it on the ground here so that can actually grow in ground, I probably would have done that to begin with. But since that wasn't an option for me and I didn't know about that at the time, the next best thing for me in terms of getting my goal started, which was to plant some kind of food, was to do it through containers. So I have a bunch of different containers here. I have these grow bags. There's different sizes. These, for example, this is a 5-gallon grow bag. I'm holding it so that you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like, because I know when I was shopping for these online, I was like, okay, they all look the same online because it's just a picture, but you can't really tell how big the bag actually is. And these work really well for peppers. This is a 3-gallon bag. For size comparison, you can see the difference in size here. I have little kiddie pools, so that's another way that I'm growing food. And of course, I have the 10-gallon containers, which are the containers I use mostly for my tomatoes, because tomatoes have, they're large plants and they have large root systems. And just for context, hopefully you can kind of tell how big this is. It's a pretty big bag. Apologies for the messy garden, but it's winter. It is what it is. And I'm freezing and I'm trying to get this done quickly, so because I want to go back inside and enjoy my warm coffee. So if you're planning to grow in containers, something that's really important for you to know, there's a variety of ways you could do that. Like I have here the fabric pots, the fabric containers. You can do something like that. You can also do, like I have over here, the kiddie pools. I've seen people use buckets. You can even use like a traditional pot. The reason why I chose to use fabric pots instead of buckets or something like that, I mean, obviously use what you have available to you, but the reason why I chose to start off with fabric pots like this is for one important reason. If you have a pot like this that you're growing, let's say a pepper plant in, or a tomato plant, those plants tend to need a lot of room. They tend to have larger root systems than something like, for example, a carrot or lettuce or something like that. What ends up happening when you have these kind of, hard pots or terracotta or whatever kind of hard bucket, whatever it is, your plants can get root bound, which basically means that if you've ever had a house plant and it got too big for its pot and you tried to transplant it to a bigger pot and you saw all the roots were going in circles around the pot, that's called being root bound. It means that basically the roots are just going in circles because they have nowhere to go. The beautiful thing about using a fabric container is that, hopefully you can see that, you can see the roots popping out of the bottom here. Fabric pots do something called air pruning. Essentially what air pruning is, it means that when the roots start to pop out of the fabric, much like they have down here on the bottom where this was touching the ground, they're going to naturally prune themselves. So you can see here on the side, probably a really dumb idea because now my fingers are going to be frozen. You can see here on the side of the bag that, or even here for that matter, that there are no roots really popping out of the side. Why is that? It's because when the root finally makes its way through the fabric, it naturally prunes itself, as opposed to it getting root bound and going in that circle that I was talking about. So once the root penetrates the bag and pops out, it'll naturally prune itself, which is good because that way you're not going to have any issues with your plants getting root bound. Now, if you're using something shallow like a kiddie pool, for example, you're not going to be able to, I mean, I guess theoretically you could give it a shot and try to grow peppers and tomatoes and stuff like that. I don't think tomatoes would really work too well in a shallow container like this, but you know, by all means, if you want to experiment, go for it. I know I've experimented with my plants to see, let's test this out a little bit. So by all means, give it a shot if that's what you want to try. However, I would suggest getting something a little higher like that for something like a tomato, because they have such intense root systems. Something like a kiddie pool is really good for like root vegetables or lettuce or something that the plant doesn't grow too large and the root systems aren't too deep. I've done beans in here. I mean, there's different things that you can do. You just have to be mindful of spacing and things like that, depending on the variety of plant that you're going to plant in whatever container it is. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're going to use something made out of plastic, like let's say a bucket or some other plastic vessel, out of a storage container, whatever it may be that you're going to use, always make sure it has drainage holes. That's incredibly important. So I have holes poked in all around the bottom of this before I even filled it with soil. That's something to keep in mind. And also something incredibly important is to remember that certain plastics and stuff and different materials can leach harmful chemicals into your soil and therefore into your plants. That's something you want to be mindful of, because the last thing you want is to, you know, you're trying to have an organic, natural garden, and lo and behold, the bucket or whatever that you're using is something that's leaching harmful chemicals into your plants and you're eating that. So, you know, you want to avoid that. There are food grade buckets that you can buy at, like, you know, Restaurant Depot or like those kind of places. I'm sure you can find them online, but you want to make sure that you're using food grade plastic if at all possible, so that you don't run into the issue of the chemicals from the plastic leaching into your plants. Just because you don't have the ability to grow something in ground doesn't mean you don't have the ability to grow large plants like tomatoes and stuff like that. Case in point, these two bags, this one and this one, they had okra in them. And okra, I still have the stem of the okra here. You can see that's a pretty thick root. I mean, I cut it to get the plant out once the season was over, but I mean, this thing was huge. It really took a lot of effort to cut this out. Once my soil here thaws out a bit, because it is frozen right now, I'm gonna end up pulling this thing out so that I can use this bag in the future come spring/summer. I just want to show you that it is possible. This is a 10-gallon bag. You really truly can grow whatever you want, for the most part, within reason, in grow bags and not have any problem. I had plenty of okra, wasn't a problem to grow it in a bag like this. When you are growing in containers, there's just some things you want to keep in mind, and I'll get into that in a bit. One last thing I want to mention, probably said that about a dozen times because as I'm walking through here, I'm remembering things that I want to tell you guys that I found to be very important for me, because when I was starting this journey, I didn't know much of anything. I mean, I had grown stuff in the past just like willy-nilly, but I had never done it in a thoughtful way where I knew exactly what varieties I wanted. I paid attention to soil amendments and soil and all of that stuff and whatever. I didn't know any of that. So that's kind of the purpose of this video, for people who were like me back in the day, where I didn't know what I was doing and I needed help just getting started. So going back to the beauty of the grow bag, one beautiful thing about them is the fact that they're portable. So if you have something that's growing in the ground naturally, like this is a natural plant that's growing in the ground. It was there before I even thought about having a garden here. When you have something that's stationary in the ground, if let's say you run into an issue where you put a plant in the ground that is, it needs more sun than it's able to get in the place that you put it, you don't have the ability to move it. So one great thing about these grow bags is that you have the ability to move them. All you got to do is grab it by the strap and take it wherever you want to take it. One thing that I didn't anticipate when I first started with these grow bags is, like I was mentioning with the roots do come out of the bottom and they do go into the ground. So you may have, I mean, the ground's frozen, but any roots that were coming out of the bottom will start to go into your ground. So they're going to get some kind of nutrition or something from the soil. Hopefully once something thaws out, I'll show you guys in the future, but it's too frozen to the ground to take it out right now. Just as much as the roots can come out of the bottom of these bags, also the water can come out of these bags too. What I was telling you guys earlier about putting drainage holes in plastic containers to make sure the water gets out so it doesn't, you know, you don't get root rot and like other overwatering issues. That's another great thing about these bags, is that whatever excess water put in here, it's either gonna seep out of the sides or it'll seep out of the bottom, which on the flip side of that could be a little problematic, because you do tend to have to water container plants, especially in these kind of bags, more often than you would something that's in the ground or something that's in a plastic container. Yet another reason why it's awesome to grow in fabric pots like this is that if you can only manage one bag, let's say all you have is one spot in your house where you can grow something, or you have a balcony and you're like, you know what, I want to grow a jalapeno plant, something like this, you can put on your balcony easy breezy. You can grow 2-3 pepper plants in a 5-gallon bag like this. Mind you, you do have to pay attention to fertilizing your plants and all that and watering, but it's doable. I've done it, so I can say for a fact that yes, you can do it. You just have to be very mindful of how you do it. And you know, something like this doesn't take up a lot of space, so it's easy to grow at least a little something in your house. If you don't have the ability to have a larger space like I have, or even like a homestead or like a larger garden or something like that, you can start. Let's say you have a balcony or a porch or something like that, and you want to grow something like lettuce because you eat a lot of salads. Something like this, it's called a green stalk planter, is perfect for that because it has such a small footprint. Look, it's just this little tiny space over here that you're taking up. Everything is growing vertically. I'm not affiliated with green stalk. I bought this with my own money, but I will say if you want to plant something like tomatoes or cucumbers, you can do that in something like this because green stalk does have like it looks kind of like a hula hoop that goes around the perimeter of the green stalk. So something that would trellis, or like, you know, like a cucumber, it has a lot of vines and leaves. It can do all that and without doing any harm to the green stalk. So that's something to keep in mind. They do have accessories that you can buy for these things. I don't personally need it. Something that has a shallow root system, these are perfect for that. However, you also can grow something that has a more intense root system, like a pepper, for example, in something like this, provided you maintain adequate watering and fertilization. And if you need to give it some extra support, you can always DIY something, but they also do make accessories for this. Something to keep in mind if you are planning to grow something like tomatoes or even cucumbers or squash or anything like that, you don't absolutely need to have a trellis, but it is in your best interest to have some sort of trellis for that. And if you have no idea what a trellis is, it basically is some kind of, you know, sturdy netting. Ideally, I would have liked to have cattle panel, but it just wasn't an option for me at the time. Why do you need a trellising system? Technically, you don't. Something like a tomato will grow on the ground, so it'll pop out of there, let's say for example, and it'll go all over the ground. You don't necessarily want that for something like a tomato because then you're inviting bugs and disease and whatnot to your plant. It's ideal rather to have everything growing vertically because that way you prevent things like unnecessary disease or pest damage. There's lots of things to keep in mind, and you're going to learn and troubleshoot as you go. I don't care if it's your first time or if you've done a garden 1,000 times in your life, there's always going to be some factor that you can't control that's going to pop up. It is what it is. But I'm trying to help you get a jump start on this so that you don't run into basic, simple issues that you can avoid if you just knew them from the get-go. So let's say you're ready to start your garden. You are like, all right, this is the year, this is the time, it's my year, I'm going to make this happen. What's the first thing that you need to do? First things first, figure out where you're going to put your garden. Figure out what size of garden you're going to have. If you're only able to have one little pot in your windowsill, that's great. If you're able to have a full-blown homestead, that's great. I mean, you can be on any end of the spectrum. The whole point is you need to figure out where you're going to put your garden. Why is that important? It's important because you want to have a dedicated space to it, but more importantly, you want to know where you get the most sun. Because if you're planning to grow something like, let's say, for example, tomatoes or peppers or whatever, you're going to need a lot of sun for that. If you take the time to look around your backyard or front yard or wherever it is that you're going to plant, take inventory of where the sun hits. Let's say you pick a spot and you're like, that's the perfect spot for it. But come to find out, you know, you plant your plants there and everything, whether it's in a container or not, and your tomatoes aren't thriving and your peppers aren't thriving because they're not getting enough sun, well, then you're running into a problem. And you kind of put all that effort into putting your plants wherever you put them for nothing. Take inventory of where the sun hits the part of your yard or garden that you want to plant in, because some plants need more sun than others. The majority of summer crops need a decent amount of sun throughout the season. So you're not going to want to really grow or put all this work into putting a garden into somewhere that gets mostly shade. That's what I did. I knew that this space over here was not used a lot. Like nobody's really walking around here. I knew that this space would be great in terms of not impeding on other parts of the yard that we use. However, it also has an amazing amount of sun throughout both the winter and the summer. So for me, this spot worked out great. Just be mindful again of where you want to put your garden. Pick out a couple of spots and just take some time, like look throughout the day where the sun hits. That'll help you, especially if if you're doing containers, but also even if you're growing in ground, it'll help you map out in the future where you're going to put what plant. Here's a bit of a sneak peek of what it is that I'm going to grow this summer. I'm going to make a whole video on what varieties I'm planting, so stay tuned for that. But we're back inside the house now. Like I said, you're getting a sneak peek of what it is that I'm going to grow this season. But let's continue the conversation. Let's say you've already figured out what size garden you're going to have, whether it's just a pot or a full-on homestead or whatever, anything in between. Let's say you figured that out. Let's say you took the time to figure out your sun patterns in the place that you want to have your garden. You figured out what kind of pots or what kind of containers you're going to use, if you're even using that. Maybe your intention is to grow in the ground. That's awesome. Let's say you've gotten through all that, right? The next thing to consider is soil and watering and amendments. Those are things I'm going to talk about in a separate video because I don't want to make this video too long, and I feel like it would be appropriate to have that in a separate video. Take the time to think about what it is that you and your family truly eat. For example, in our house, we love cucumbers, we love peppers, we love tomatoes. So the overwhelming majority of the stuff that I grow are those kind of plants. If your family does not eat, let's say, hot peppers, there's no need to go and buy a bunch of hot pepper plants and take the time to start them from seed, or even if you're transplanting it from a start that you bought at your local hardware store or at a farmer's market or something like that. Let's use this as an example. Let's say you grow Tabasco plants because you want to make hot sauce for Christmas gifts. That's something different. That's your prerogative. Do what makes you happy. But if you're doing it strictly for your own family and for your own food consumption, there's no need to grow something like a pepper plant if your family does not eat peppers. My intention for this gardening season is to kind of make my garden a workhorse to preserve a bunch of things that I know we use a lot of. And not only I kept in mind that, okay, we do like fresh cucumbers and tomatoes and blah, blah, blah. We go through a lot of chickpeas. I don't have any chickpea plants here. And that's something that if I had the space and the ability, I would love to have a bunch of chickpea plants, garbanzo beans. So, I looked at other things. And one thing we go through a lot of hot sauce, hence the Tabasco peppers. We also go through a lot of pickles, hence the pickling cucumbers. Those are canned items that I have the ability to grow them. I have the space and the tools and whatnot, the resources available to me to grow these things, but they're also things that we eat a tremendous amount of throughout the year. So it makes sense for me to grow something like a Tabasco pepper or let's say a pickling cucumber or what have you. Those are items we eat a lot of, and we tend to buy a lot of those canned. So like canned tomato sauce or pasta sauce or some pizza sauce, whatever. We use a lot of that throughout the year. So it makes sense for me to have the type of variety of plants that will accommodate my needs. To make a very long story short, I've been ranting for about 10 minutes about this. Take inventory of what it is that your family eats and buy seeds or started plants or what have you that are things that you're going to eat. There's some important things that I want to point out here on the back of the seed packet that are going to play a huge role in how you plant your garden and when you plant your garden and all that good stuff. Let's say you've thought about all the things we've talked about before. The next thing you're going to want to do is get the plants ready to go, because there's no garden without plants, right? A lot of people will either start from seed, which is what I prefer to do, or you can buy started plants at your local hardware store or your farmer's market or wherever you source your started plants. If you're doing your garden from started plants, you likely will have to go online to do some research on the variety it is that you're planting, because the little markers that they put in the started plant really don't have too much information. So that's something to keep in mind. From seed, there's a lot of important information on the back of the seed packet. It's there for a reason. And I want to review this for someone who's never done this before, because there are some terms in here that you may be like, okay, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to get that information. So I'm going to walk you through this really briefly. And if you're a seasoned gardener, feel free to skip this part. But this is for the people who have never grown from seed before. The most important thing when you're starting your plants is figuring out when to start them. So here it gives you two options. It tells you can either sow them outside or you can start them inside. I would highly recommend, if you're able to, something like tomatoes and cucumbers and whatever, start them indoors. You can even see here it says recommended. There's a reason why it's recommended. It's because it's the most ideal way to get your plants started in a more controlled environment. It's easier to troubleshoot when everything's indoors. We'll talk about starting your seeds in a separate video. Here it tells you that if you're going to start your seeds indoors, you're ideally going to want to do it between 4 to 6 weeks before transplanting. Transplanting means to take it outside and put it in the ground or into your container outdoors. So that tells you approximately when you you want to start your seeds. It also tells you when you want to transplant them outside. So 1 to 2 weeks after your last average frost date. If you're like, what in the world is the last frost date? How do I find that information for my area? I'm going to give you a little bit of a demonstration on that so you have a better understanding, especially if it's your first time, how to find out what your last frost date is and do the calculations based on that so you know when to start your seeds. Another thing you want to keep in mind, another hugely important piece of information on here besides when to start your seeds, is how long it takes for that plant to grow from seed to maturity. Maturity meaning you're ready to harvest whatever it is that you're planting. So for this variety, it says 57 days from transplanting. You know, back in the day, how we all said when we were in grade school or what have you, we're like, I'm never going to use math. Well, guess what? If you want to be a gardener, you're going to have to do some math because there's a lot of calculations involved if you want to get your seeds started in at the right time so that you can transplant them outside. Going back to plant maturity, 57 days from transplanting, there are going to be some varieties of plants that have longer days to maturity. For this plant, it says that it takes 80 to 90 days until maturity. Why is that important? If you have a shorter growing season, you're going to want to pick plants that don't require as long to mature. Every variety is different. That's why they put this kind of information on the back of the seed packet, because it gives you an idea of how long it's going to take for your plant to fully mature, and therefore you can do your calculations on when you're starting seeds and when you're transplanting and whatever based on that. And I'm going to show you that in the little demonstration. First things first, let's talk about hardiness zone. Now, this is something that primarily utilized in the United States. I'm sure there are other places that may have adapted this. I do live in the United States, and this is a map that we go by here. It divides the country up into different hardiness zones, and what that means is that it gives you your average and low temperatures for your area. So here we can see the different zones and the different low temperatures for those corresponding areas. If you've ever watched any of my videos, then you know that I'm gardening in zone 7A. We can take a quick look at that and see what my average low temperatures are. And here's the rest of the different zones. So zone 7A is that light green color, and I just want to show you the light green color extends from one side of the country, kind of goes all the way around, and it takes us all the way back to the northeastern part of the United States. It's important to know what your hardiness zone is because it helps you get a better understanding of how long your growing season is and so what type of plants that you can grow in your area. There's one caveat to this. Someone who's gardening in zone 7A over here may have a much shorter growing season than someone who's gardening in zone 7A over here, right? Just because you're in zone XYZ doesn't mean that you have the same exact amount of time that someone who is also in that same zone across the country has. Here's another map which makes life a little bit easier because you're able to plug in your address and figure out exactly what your zone is without too much hassle if you don't feel like combing through the actual map to see. So I just wanted to show you this real quick so that if for whatever reason you just want to plug in your address and call it a day, you can do that here. A map, and this one's kind of interesting because it gives you a better picture of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the different hardiness zones. This map is all grayed out with the exception of zone 7A and 7B. We all know that temperatures on the East Coast are not identical to temperatures on the West Coast or in the South or what have you. So this kind of gives you an idea of how far zone 7 stretches. It goes from one side of the country to the other. I'm going to pick two different cities from within zone 7 and so that we can kind of compare and contrast what all of this information means. Let's go with Raleigh and Boise. And we're going to take those two cities and compare and contrast them so we can get a better understanding of how this whole zone thing works. Before we get started with this next step, I just want to make one little clarification. Me, for example, where I live, I'm kind of on the border of zone 7A and zone 7B. Why is that important? Zone 7A has a shorter growing season than zone 7B. So for me, I like to err on the side of caution, and when I'm doing my research or whatever it is, I like to think of things in the mindset of zone 7A, which has a shorter growing season, because if I think about everything in terms of zone 7B, which is slightly longer, I may run into some issues in the future in terms of, I don't have enough time for this variety to mature or what have you, or I started my seeds too late or I started them too early or whatever it is. At least that way, it's always good to have too much time than not enough. So it helps you with your planning. Let's go back to what we were talking about first frost dates and last frost dates. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in Boise and search that. And we can see here that for Boise, Idaho, their growing season is 152 days. Their last frost date, which means the threat of frost is over, is approximately May 7th. And their first frost date, which is, okay, we're about to get some snow or like cold weather or frost basically, is October 7th. Now, I would suggest to you, especially if this is your first time growing, do not use these as like a hard stop kind of date. These are approximations. These are aggregates of a bunch of data from past years that have been collected. If you read the back of any seed packet, a lot of them will say, pretty much all of them will say, start these seeds 4 weeks before the last frost, or direct sow outside 6 weeks after the last frost. It's also very important to know how many days you have in your growing season, because that gives you a better understanding of the different varieties that you may have and how long it takes for them to grow. So if you're trying to grow a tomato plant, for example, that requires 200 days from starting the seed until you have the actual fruit in your hand, and you go and you punch in your numbers and you see, like in Boise, for example, I only have 152 days. It'll help you better plan your garden, because that way you know that, okay, this particular variety, either I have to come up with some kind of solution in terms of keeping the plant warm or starting it early or what have you, or perhaps you should just forego that variety and find a variety that's better suited for your area that only takes 100 days to grow. That way you know, okay, I have 152 days. This particular variety only takes 100. I'm going to be all right. Let's go back and check Raleigh. Now we can see the difference. Both of these cities are in the same growing zone, but look at the difference in dates, and look at, more importantly, the difference in how long the growing season is. Like I said, same zones for both of these cities, but because Raleigh is where it is, it has a longer growing season. So for folks in Raleigh, you have 203 days approximately for your growing season. All of these numbers and everything, it sounds like a lot. It sounds really confusing, but it's really not that difficult. It's not a big deal. As long as you jot down these numbers, it'll be so much more handy for you in the future when it comes time to actually sit down and pick your varieties that you want to grow, and starting your seeds and doing all that, and transplanting plants outside. It's very important to know these numbers. You can also just simply go to Google and type in calculate between two dates and pull up something like this and just plug in your dates, and it'll automatically calculate it for you. All right, moving on. You figured out what your gardening zone is. You figured out what your first and last frost dates are. You've calculated how long your growing season is, and you're ready to start your seeds in a seed tray. You're all excited and pumped up about it. You know exactly what varieties you want to plant. Now it's time to go back to the varieties that you have chosen. And mind you want to do this before you start buying seeds, ideally, just so that you're not wasting money on seeds that you don't have enough time to grow. Like I said earlier with the whole days to maturity issue, once you've selected the type of plant, so let's say tomato, now's the time to go back to the seed packet. A lot of this information is available online prior to buying seeds if you want to do your research beforehand. Now is the time to do the math and figure out, okay, let's say, for example, your growing season is 150 days. You have plenty of time to grow something like this. It's telling you here that it takes 80 to 90 days to mature. It also tells you it takes about a week to 2 weeks for the seeds to germinate. Those are all things that you're going to want to combine into your calculations when you're starting your seeds. Let's say you wait until the last minute, which we've all done. You wait until the last minute to get your seeds started, or you waited way too long to get your seeds started. Maybe you waited like an extra month or something before starting your seeds. Well, if the variety that you've selected takes about, let's use the high end number, 90 days to reach maturity, and you've already lost a month because you didn't start your seeds in time, and they still take about a week or two to germinate, then you're cutting it close in terms of whether or not you're going to get an abundance of food from the plants that you've grown. You don't want to go through all the trouble of starting your plants in little seed cells and transplanting them and taking care of them and getting your grow lights and spending all this time and money and energy into something that you're not going to get a bounty from. Once you've taken care of all those issues, you figured out all the things that we've talked about throughout this video, there's a couple of last minute things I want to mention to keep in mind, especially if you're a first time gardener. They're kind of on the negative side, but I'm going to talk about them anyway. All right, one thing I want to talk about really quickly is to not be rigid. What do I mean by that? This seed packet says that your plant space spacing needs to be 24 inches apart. That's the ideal spacing. The reason why that information is on the seed packet in the first place is because it gives you the ideal situation. Ideally, you want your plants to be 24 inches apart. However, don't feel like because you've measured it out with a ruler or with a tape measure or something and you're like, okay, I don't have exactly 24 inches, I can't grow this. Don't be rigid like that. Don't think like that. Let's say you don't have the 24 inches of space between plants. You can still grow those things. All of this information are ideals. They're ideal for that particular variety. You're free to experiment and do whatever you want. I mean, you want to keep this information in mind. It's there for a reason, like I said. If you really want your plants to reach their maximum potential, then these are the things that you want to keep in mind. However, if you're unable to have it exactly like what it says on the seed packet, that doesn't mean that you're not able to grow whatever it is that you want to grow. The last thing I want to talk about, again, a little on the negative side, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it's important. Be prepared to fail. And I know that sounds awful and you're probably like, why are you trying to encourage us to grow a garden? The whole point of this video is to encourage people to grow a garden, and now you're talking about failure. Failure is part of gardening. It is what it is. There's no getting around it. Something like the weather, for example, or pests, you have no control over that. I mean, you can do the best you can. Let's say pests, for example. You're going to have pest problems. It's inevitable, especially if you're growing outside. It comes with the territory. There are going to be plants that you're going to start that you've started 20 plants and all of them died before you had a chance to transplant them outdoors. Things like that are going to happen. Maybe you're super excited about growing jalapenos and you put them out too early and you had a late frost and it killed all your plants. I mean, stuff like that happens. You know, while it is negative to say be prepared to fail, and of course we don't want to fail, but there are things that are going to happen that are out of your control and you just have to roll with the punches. There's really no way around it. It is what it is. It's part of the journey. The wonderful thing about failures is that you learn from them. Don't take those failures as like you're a horrible gardener and you don't know what you're doing. Even the most seasoned gardeners, even I'm sure commercial gardeners have issues that pop up that are out of their control and they just have to roll with it. Take those failures and turn them into lessons, because all of the issues that you're going to run into, once you learn how to troubleshoot them and you do your research, if a similar issue pops up in the future, you have now experience under your belt to know how to troubleshoot that. And that's why failures, while they suck and no one wants to fail at anything, they're also incredibly important because you learn as you grow. That's kind of my theme around here, is learning as I grow. As I've gone through this journey, and I'm still very much a beginner in a lot of ways, there are things that you're going to learn all the time. At the end of the day, they're all learning experiences that are going to make you a better gardener in the long run. All right, I think this video is long enough. Let's wrap this up. If you have any questions about starting gardens that I haven't covered in this video, please leave your comments down below. I'd be happy to answer whatever questions you may have. Like I said earlier, I am going to talk about like soil and trying to save money with that, because soil is a huge expense. Whether your garden is similar in size to mine or you have like a larger garden or what have you, everyone will say the same thing, that the majority of the money that you're going to have to invest into your garden is going to be for the soil. Without good soil, you're not going to have good plants. That's just part of the gig. So I'll be talking about soil and amendments and tips and tricks to save some money on that in a separate video. I hope this video was helpful for you, especially if you're a first-time gardener. I know it can be incredibly frustrating. I know it was frustrating for me to have to watch a billion different videos and get little tidbits from each one. I mean, it was a fun experience and very educational for me, but it also could be incredibly frustrating at times, because I'm like, okay, folks are explaining things as if I know what they're talking about and I don't understand those terms. That's what I really hope you first-time gardeners out there get from this video, is to have a basic understanding. This is not meant to be an extreme in-depth first-time gardening guide. It's just to give you the highlights of the things that are important if you're planning to start a garden, especially if you're starting a container garden like I have. Feel free to leave your questions and comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time. I know this video is a little bit all over the place. Thank you for bearing with me with that. And I will catch you in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe.